Join the conversation. Like us on Facebook at C-SPAN History.
Next on Real America, from June 16, 1968, California Governor Ronald Reagan appeared on CBS's Face the Nation to take questions from journalists. The future president discusses the 1968 presidential candidates, including Richard Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller, and George Wallace. He also discusses liberalism and conservatism, student protests, the recent assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy, and what he argues are the failures of Democrats in Congress and the White House.
Governor Reagan, at the Republican Governors Conference in Tulsa, the consensus was that for 2 days you conducted yourself like a candidate for your party's presidential or vice presidential nomination. Do you still maintain you're not a possible contender for either office?
No, and I would be hard put to know where anyone got that idea. I attended all of the meetings. I don't know of anything I did on the outside except agree to a press conference, which was asked of me. And other than that, I was in the meetings where the press wasn't present or none of the public.
In Tulsa, Oklahoma, at the Republican Governors Conference, in color, Face the Nation, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview with Governor Ronald Reagan of California. Governor Reagan will be questioned by CBS News correspondent Bill Stout, Paul Hope of the Washington Star, and CBS News correspondent Martin Nagronsky. We shall resume the interview with Governor Reagan in a moment.
Governor, I wonder if we can go back to that question. Do you still maintain you're not a possible contender for either the presidential or vice presidential office?
Well, I'm certainly not a contender for the latter, for the vice presidential office. I think technically you'd have to recognize that anyone who is a favorite son candidate, even though he is a favorite son candidate only in the sense of directing a delegation or hoping to, that technically at the convention he is a candidate. He is entered in nomination and would be a candidate if the party chose to consider him as such.
Well, now, really, you're more than technically a candidate, aren't you?
Well, you mean at the convention?
I mean now at the convention, anytime.
Well, I certainly am not now. I haven't injected myself into this race, nor would I. But at the convention, as I say, I use the word technically because it is true that you actually are placed in nomination. That's true of me as well as a number of other favorite son candidates. And I have said for some time that I believe this is going to be an open convention. And therefore, if the delegates choose to consider other than the announced candidates, they'll do so.
When you say that you haven't conducted yourself here, Governor, as a possible contender, you're talking perhaps about your own attitude. But what do you think of the attitudes of the people? The people and the delegates decide who will run. You don't really decide for yourself, and no man going into a convention does.
Bill, I've said this for a long time. I think the people do. This job seeks rather than someone seeking it. And this you have very little control over. I'm aware of a great many people who have expressed this belief with regard to me, and I'm greatly honored, as I've said before, that anyone should consider me in that light. But I can again say that I have been doing my job, and I have done nothing to encourage or to try and set up any organization to promote that sort of thing.
Well, Governor, let's carry you. You carried yourself a step further, at least. Now we have you saying you're not considering yourself as a contender for the vice presidential nomination, but you can't help it if you go as a favorite son, which makes you a contender for the presidential nomination. Now, could you address yourself to this? Which candidate of the two men who do say they want to be president, get the presidential nomination on the Republican ticket, Nixon or Rockefeller, with which of those two could you most easily make common cause?
Well, now I have to not only be evasive, I just have to avoid the answer. Because I have asked our own delegation. We have only had one organizing meeting so far, and that was prior to the official placing them on the ballot or getting them recognized on the ballot as the delegation. I've asked all of our delegates to not give any opinion as to who they might favor when and if the time comes to make a move in some direction, in order to ensure the very unity that caused us to have a single delegation to begin with. Now, it'd hardly behoove me now to come on television nationwide and announce a preference of my own. I just can't do it.
Well, as governor of the largest state in the Union, don't you feel some obligation to lead the people?
Oh, yes.
To tell them who you're for?
No, we ran on the basis of a broad-based delegation in which if we were for someone in advance, we would have sought a delegation of people who were pledged or who leaned in that same direction. We didn't. In the interest of unity, which was the whole purpose of this, we have a delegation from California that represents the whole spectrum of the California Party. We have people who are actively in support of various candidates on that delegation and who have had past support for those delegates. Now, the idea of not having an open primary in the interest of unity was so that at the convention, when all the facts are in and it is time to make a decision for who we think will be the winner and the next president of the United States, to say nothing of platform decisions, that hopefully our delegation can resolve its differences within itself and operate as a unit for the best interest not only of the country, but of our party.
Aren't you really playing it a little cozy, expecting that something's going to develop for you at the convention?
No, I don't think so. As a matter of fact, the only thing I can give you by way of proof of sincerity is, and Bill being a Californian knows this, that I was the one who was opposed to a favorite son candidacy. And this was announced the day after I was elected at a joint press conference with Bob Finch, the lieutenant governor, and Bob publicly stated then he was going to do everything he could to convince me I should be one in the interest of unity. And the result was the party leaders and our state central committee officers were the ones who persuaded me that I should be the favorite son candidate.
Governor, can we get one thing? Perhaps you could tell us, would you say your political philosophy was closer to that of Mr. Nixon or Mr. Rockefeller?
Well, I think without my answering that, you could probably say that to me.
No, why should I answer the question?
Well, because I think that on the basis of views expressed, for example, right now in the Vietnam conflict, or on the approach of, or the involvement of government in the solution of some problems, yes, I would think that this would be a fair statement.
What would be a fair statement?
That I have perhaps tended towards solutions of national problems more in the same context or vein that Richard Nixon has than I have at times with Governor Rockefeller.
Let's take this a step further, Governor. When we talk about the convention and the delegates, there are estimates ranging from, I've heard 38%, I've heard 60%. Of Goldwater delegates and alternates returning this year to Miami. Do you see yourself as the only hope of the conservatives in the party? They certainly are not going to rally around Nelson Rockefeller, and many of them may not around Richard Nixon. Where else do they have to go except to you?
Well, Bill, I as you know, won't go along anymore with using those labels. I've been working for 2 years trying to get the party to drop the labels.
Well, a great many people do use them.
And yet we've been very successful, though, with getting them to. I think there is a different philosophy or belief in the Republican Party today at the grassroots level and on up through the pros. I think you will find the Republican Party today is far more willing to see good in other Republicans in the interest of unity and in the interest of winning. There is a great desire. We've had our bloodbath and learned a lesson from it. The party was virtually out of existence just a few years ago. And I don't think that you're going to have that problem. I don't think people are going to this convention frozen into an ideological mold as they have been at some times in the past.
Governor, let's not talk about being frozen. You do say that your political philosophy comes closer to that of Mr. Nixon and to Mr. Rockefeller. I mean, that is one position you have taken now. Now, the Nixon coordinator in the South, Mr. Callaway, recently said perhaps we can get George Wallace on our side. That's where he belongs. Would you feel that George Wallace belongs on the Republican side, and would you welcome him in the Republican Party?
Well, I think this is the decision. If George Wallace belongs on the Republican side, then he should re-register. But he is still registered as a Democrat. And it would seem to me that anyone, I've always believed that anyone who wants to come into the Republican Party has come in by virtue of buying our philosophy But we don't go out after someone by virtue of buying theirs. And therefore, if he found that he was compatible and could believe in the philosophy of the Republican Party, then I would think that his place was in our party.
You could welcome him to the party under those circumstances.
Under the circumstances that he subscribed to our philosophy.
Well, do you think he's compatible with your philosophy?
Well, I think if you look at his record as a governor, you will find a number of instances where, on domestic issues, he has been right in line with the present democratic philosophy of government control and subsidy and regulation and so forth, which would be contrary to Republican philosophy. At the moment, no question that he's expressed some views, particularly in the international scene, regarding Americanism and patriotism and so forth, that I'm sure few people disagree with.
What about his position on racist problems?
Well, he seems to have avoided that subject pretty well. I haven't heard too many statements, not that I've heard everything he says or even paid too much attention to it, but I haven't heard that much has been said that he's
well, his
dwelling
position,
on
I
that
mean,
subject.
against integration, to make a specific point.
Well, I happen to be one who believes in, first of all, I am incapable of feeling prejudice myself. I do not believe in discrimination, and I certainly believe in equality of opportunity for all people, and I believe that the answer to the problem will come someday when all of us in America will stop using, just as we've stopped using the labels in our party, we'll stop hyphenating ourselves and using a word in front of American with a hyphen.
Let's go back to these labels, Governor, that you object to, but most people in this country employ in common talk: liberal and conservative. Senator Kuechel lost to Max Rafferty, and there doesn't seem much argument within the Republican Party that Kuechel represented the moderate or liberal wing and Rafferty the conservative, perhaps the right wing. What do you make of that?
Well, I recall during the campaign hearing both of them comparing, one, the contender, comparing his views, and the other comparing his vote record with the voting record of Senator George Murphy. And they came out about even with their support of the things that George Murphy had stood for. Now, I think the Kuechel-Rafferty campaign, there were a number of factors. First of all, the contender in this case has been a very successful campaigner in California, winner of 2 elections by wide margins, one by a very wide margin. He is known to the people of California, and the other didn't campaign as actively, spending a great deal of his time in Washington because the Senate was in session. And I think that Max Rafferty himself gave a view that cannot be discounted too much. He said that he believed there is such dissatisfaction on the part of the people today with what's been going on that there is a kind of tendency against the incumbent instead of the other way around.
Not just swing to the right, but against individual incumbents.
That's right. There's a sort of let's have a change.
Well, how much did party loyalty play in the Kuechel-Rafferty race? Kuechel did not support you. He didn't support Nixon. He didn't support George Murphy. Was that a major factor?
Well, now there you'd have to ask the people who voted and why they voted. I would have no way of knowing.
Do you think it was a factor?
I honestly don't know. It was a hard-fought campaign. They criticized each other, but I think there was basically adherence to our 11th commandment. There was no, they didn't inject personalities and get into that kind of bitterness at all.
Well, Rockefeller didn't support Barry Goldwater in 1964. Do you think this should be a factor in his candidacy this year? Is he entitled to the nomination, not having supported the nominee in '64?
I'm opposed to anything that is going to reopen old wounds or that is going to lessen our chances for making a change. I think it is vitally important in America today that we have a change. I think the present Democratic leadership has taken this country, or lack of leadership, actually, has taken this country down a road that can lead only to disaster and ruin for the country. And I think the issue is far more important than dredging up or remembering any past grudge.
But Republicans have to nominate a nominee. If the people do not know where the Republicans stand, if they don't talk about one another, how are they supposed to decide?
Well, in California in 1966, we waged a primary in which we campaigned our views and what we would do as opposed to those of the incumbent Democratic administration. And the people made the decision on who they thought would be the best replacement for that administration. This does not mean that you take on the other fellow. You state your case. You run against the opposition. You know, this is a tryout for who's going to run in the big race against the other school. And I've likened it to a track meet. If on Wednesday afternoon the kids go out on the track to do 100 yards to determine who's going to run on Saturday against the other school in the big track meet, you've tried to find out who's the fastest. You don't go down the track spiking each other to see who can be the only survivor.
Yeah, but that's a different game, Governor. That's not politics.
Well, no, I don't think it's a different game. What are we interested in? We are interested in the views of the Republican candidates and what they would offer and what they would propose in contrast to the leadership that we now have in Washington. And thus, there's no need to point a finger at any other Republican candidate. You state your case, what you would do.
Oh, but it always happened.
What?
It's always happened in every campaign, particularly in primaries. And I'm sure it happened in the '66 primary between you and George Christopher.
Well, no, I would ask you to go back and find one word that I ever said about him or even mentioned his name.
But it takes two. You know, he said a great many things.
Well, whether that had anything to do with the result or not, people made a decision.
Governor, would you say there's a fundamental difference between your position on Vietnam and that of Nelson Rockefeller?
I can't say that I'm a complete authority on his position. I used this just as an example a moment ago, and incidentally, let me correct one. If I gave an impression there that this meant that I was supposed to be favoring one over the other. No, you asked a question, I honestly tried to answer it. But at the same time, in governors' conferences, Governor Rockefeller and I have been in great agreement on many times across the table on issues that were confronting us. I know that he has announced, whether he has stated it already or not, a position, or that he's going to explain a position on Vietnam. But it has been when I said that I perhaps was closer on that one, looking for an example. I think that what I was actually trying to say was that both Richard Nixon and I have, over the period of the past year, spoken out against the limited war concept, against a win policy, and against the need to be there. Now, my
against the
impression
win
is,
policy and against the need to be there, you mean you're willing to lose and
against
you're willing
the
to withdraw?
no, against, did I say win? Against the no-win?
No-win policy.
The no-win policy. It's been my impression that perhaps Nelson is placing a little more faith in the negotiations or in some kind of compromise settlement than I find myself able to.
You have no
accept.
faith in that prospect of Paris?
Oh, I can hope for peace, but I don't hope for the kind of peace that would result in, say, a concession that would allow the Viet Cong to be a part of the South Vietnamese government. I think this would be about the same as the United States government taking the Cosa Nostra in as partners.
Governor, if we can move to a different topic. The day after Senator Kennedy died, or perhaps it was the day he died, you blamed demagogic and irresponsible leaders in and out of office. You said that their words had fed this attitude of lawlessness in our society. And as I recall, after that news conference in Sacramento, you refused to identify any of them, or you failed to identify them. Can you tell us now, what kind of people did you have in mind? What are their names?
Well, Bill, let me straighten one thing out. I didn't say demagogic leaders. I said demagogic statements by people in and out of public office. Now, a demagogic statement can be deliberate. It can also simply be carelessness on the part of the individual who didn't intend to be a demagogue. But you can go back. One of the reasons for not naming an individual is to try and pick out and name one would be unfair unless you were going to compile a list of all of them and their statements and say, here, all of these statements we think have contributed to this atmosphere. But we have had statements.
More specifically, Governor, did you have Senator Robert Kennedy's statements in mind, his own statements?
I can only tell you that Robert Kennedy, in the last several weeks in California, has actually been campaigning on a basis of healing the wounds, restoring law and order, stopping the violence in our country, and stopping inflaming the passions.
Kennedy. Whom did you mean, Governor?
I was talking about I wasn't talking about individuals. I was talking about statements, and I will repeat.
Well,
and perhaps some of them
make statements.
All right, some of them might have been attributed to him. But statements such as someone saying that if he lived in a slum, he too would join a rebellion or could wage a pretty rebellion.
Is that what you're talking about?
This is the kind of statement I'm talking about. I'm talking about statements made several years ago of a statement that perhaps a jail record would be a mark of honor in this country with regard to being arrested for demonstrations and so forth. I'm talking about any statement of the kind that encourages riots. Now, these could encompass a great many commencement speakers of the last week or so who have appeared on a number of campuses, and they come from a number of lines of activity, including academic, including the judicial, and public figures who have talked about encouraging supposedly just dissent, but encouraging the type of rioting that we've seen in our campuses. I claim these statements are demagogic, and I claim it's time for anyone who is going to speak publicly to think twice with regard to his words, and any word that he thinks might be used, even misinterpreted by someone as to be a ticket or an admission for him to go out and take the law into his own hands, we'd better think twice.
Governor, you've talked about student protests. Where would you draw the line on student protests on our campuses?
Well, we have in this country a built-in system for dissent. This is what we mean by freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. We have a right to try and persuade our fellow citizens, to try and persuade our elected officials. But I think that dissent must stop short of interfering with the rights of other individuals. When a group takes over the administration building and other buildings of a campus, when they interfere with the orderly processes of the administration, when they force the cancellation of classes and studies on the part of the majority who happens to disagree with them, when they attempt by force to prevent recruiters from various industrial firms from coming on a campus seeking future employees, when they go out in the street and stage civil disobedience, it's all well and good to say that they're staging the civil disobedience with an idea that that they will pay the price by being arrested. But how do they repay the person who might have been in an ambulance on their way to the hospital, who was blocked and held up by this demonstration in the street? How do they repay the person perhaps whose house burned down because the fire department couldn't get through the thousands of people, let us say in one of our California cities, who were attempting to attack a draft center? Civil disobedience. In taking the law into your own hands, you very rarely, if at all, can do this without interfering with the basic rights of someone else. And with this, we have no right to do.
Do you think the president should have let the Poor People's Campaign camp on public lands in Washington?
No, I don't. Unless they were grounds suitable for camping, unless they were coming into an area where this was the custom and where this was proper. Frankly, I am in disagreement with this particular march, and I'm in disagreement with the government's acceptance of it on the basis not of disagreeing with the goals. I think all of us want to do everything we can to lift the standard of living, to bring everyone up as high as they can be brought, to enjoy the things that this society of ours can afford. But I think there is a great disillusionment coming to many people. First of all, the idea that by coming and staging such a demonstration in Washington, they can persuade the Congress to pass some law that's going to eliminate poverty or alleviate it even, is a falsehood. And many people are deluded into believing that this can take place. There's nothing wrong with the American people or the American government's attitude toward poverty. Our record proves we have spent billions of dollars in hundreds of programs in a legitimate effort to try and find an answer to these problems. But the truth is, it is the manner in which we've done it that has failed. There's no lack of intent. They don't have to persuade Congress to feel a sympathy for the poor. We already have that.
Governor, they are poor. They feel that the remedy is not in sight immediately for them, and they sought this way, apparently, to dramatize their position. This was under the aegis, really, of the right of a public demonstration, the effort of people to seek redress from the Congress itself. But you would disagree with the president in having permitted them to take the position that they did in the shadow, as it were, of the Lincoln Memorial?
Yes, because, again, I must say, I think that a great many people are going to be disillusioned. We're deluded into believing that this could result in some immediate answer to their problem. Now again, you get back to dissent and what is needed in this country, there are a great many voices have been heard. One of them was the late Senator Robert Kennedy's, saying virtually the same things that I've been saying in California. As a matter of fact, in California, he was advocating what we are doing in California, a program to provide jobs to the poor, to the minority element. And here, in other words, was a place. Proper leaders of the poor should be telling them, support those people today who are advocating a change in the programs that are a failure.
But, Governor, even before the horror of the Ambassador Hotel, Robert Kennedy also spoke for tougher gun control laws. And you have said we probably have the best laws in the nation in California now.
We do.
You think we
Gentlemen,
do?
Yes, we do.
Gentlemen, I really regret our time is up. Thank you very much, Governor Reagan, for being here to face the nation. A word about next week's guest in a moment.
Today on Face the Nation, Governor Ronald Reagan of California was interviewed by CBS News correspondent Bill Stout. Paul Hope of the Washington Star. CBS News correspondent Martin Negronsky led the questioning. Next week, Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut, leader in the fight for a strong gun control bill, and Harold Glasson, president of the National Rifle Association, which is fighting additional gun control legislation, will face the nation.
Up next on Real America, we continue our look back at the 1968